Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our west coast became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of them American citizens, 1/3 aliens. We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous, but no one knew what would happen among this concentrated population. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move.
One of the themes that I really want in my book is like, how did the Japanese Americans who were trying to be such proper Americans and live and look that perfect, how did they grapple with it?
The evacuees cooperated wholeheartedly. The many loyal among them felt that this was a sacrifice they could make in behalf of America's war effort.
I think, sometimes people can do that when they have suffered something very hard, to let's look on the bright side of things. Why did you do that? The story that I keep hearing people say that hasn't been told is, what was life like when people got back from the camps? And I would want to talk to my mom about it. She'd listen, but then she'd always want to put that, that spin of, but, it could be worse or something like that. And it never felt satisfying to me to have these kinds of conversations with her. Why did you let the government do that? It's such an interesting story that I think people in Tacoma and the people in the country don't fully know about. Yeah, I guess just for the bigger, larger community is like us taking and examining, like, why are some cultures okay and other cultures aren't okay? Why are some more acceptable than other cultures? When Pearl Harbor happened, people were very afraid, and they thought, if I have anything that looks Japanese in my home, they will question my loyalty.
The American citizen Japanese and Japanese aliens made plans in accordance with orders. Notices were posted. All persons of Japanese descent were required to register.
So people burned family heirlooms, photos, and so a lot of the families don't have heirlooms.
They gathered in their own churches and schools, and the Japanese themselves cheerfully handled the enormous paperwork involved in the migration.
When I visited Heart Mountain, they had the registry of all of the people that were imprisoned there, and I found my father and my mother, and they were just like when you go to prison, you're given a number. So my father was 10522, and my mother's family was 19423. And it's a pretty interesting document because it says when they entered, when they left, and what block they were in. I also have visited the former Heart Mountain camp, where they have an exhibit there. I have to say, that experience left an imprint on my head. Standing there at a barrack was pretty startling. The barracks just, you can tell they're hastily put up. The boards, didn't meet because it was wood that was not cured, and the only covering was tar paper. And so we got to see that firsthand. That's when I saw that the toilets didn't have partitions between them. The hospitals were inadequately equipped, and people died as a result.
Congressman Norman Mineta, with us today, was 10 years old when his family was interned. In the congressman's words, "My own family was sent first to Santa Anita Racetrack. We showered in the horse paddocks. Some families lived in converted stables, others in hastily thrown together barracks. We were then moved to Heart Mountain, Wyoming, where our entire family lived in one small room of a rude tar paper barrack. Like so many tens of thousands of others, the members of the Moneta family lived in those conditions not for a matter of weeks or months, but for 3 long years.
Reading firsthand accounts of what the camps were like, I read one book where he was young at the time, wrote the book as an older man, but he talked about waking up in the morning, and he's from Southern California, so they had never experienced snow. He wakes up in the morning and there is, snow on his blanket, because in the barracks there wasn't good insulation at all. And so here I found amongst my parents' things is the Tule Lake reunion, and then the Heart Mountain reunion. And this one actually was interesting because it's in Seattle, because I think at the time it was just too difficult for people to go out to the actual camps, and there's really nothing there. They hadn't built up the interpretive centers yet. So I think, reflecting now, I think there's just so much trauma that just happened to them that, when they're having these kind of natural emotions, they don't even understand the depth of that. What the Issei people said over and over is, it can't be helped that they're in this camp. It can't be helped. So when I hear that it can't be helped, there in Buddhism, there is a teaching about acceptance. If we accept, we don't suffer. So an example of that is, I'll go back to the one about my mom not really wanting me to grow up. If a person is clinging to the idea that I want to, hold on to my child, I don't want them to leave, you suffer. And so the idea is to accept what is, and you won't suffer.
In the really important things, relocation centers are not normal and probably never can be. Home life is disrupted. Eating, living, and working conditions are abnormal. Training of children is difficult. Americanism, taught in the schools and churches and on the playgrounds, loses much of its meaning in the confines of a relocation center.
Because it's just giving yourself time to process, really. Sorry, I'm going to cry again. What happened? If you're from Tacoma, you're now in the camps, you don't have anything. You don't have furniture, you don't have your business, you don't have a car, you have nothing, no dishes. Why would you go back to Tacoma? There's nothing there for you. Your home is already rented out to somebody else. There was a lot of racism going on in this area, and people didn't want them back. So I can imagine my mother walking in a place that's so familiar to her, like her neighborhood, and it's the same homes, and it's the same street, the same trees, but all the people are different. And I can't imagine, what would that feel like? And so the few people that did come back, they had no place to live. There was a housing shortage. People didn't have money. I think the government gave each person, I think this is right, $25 each and a one-way ticket for a one-way ticket back to wherever they're going. My childhood friend is the executive director of the Japanese Cultural Center in Seattle, and I went to her, and I just hadn't been writing at that point yet, and I said, kind of tossing this idea around writing a novel. And I said, do you know about any writers groups? And she goes, well, what do you know? We have a writers group right where I work. I said, really? And so I was really hesitant to join this group because I thought, oh, these are going to be just a bunch of intellectuals that have like perfect grammar. And so I waited, I think 2 or 3 months before I was told about this group to even go. And so I went, but they're very nice. And so That group is great because they're all Japanese American. I can fact check with them, get ideas from them. And it holds me accountable because we read each month, we read our story, and then we get feedback. So I feel really fortunate that I have family friends that I've been interviewing, and one family friend, Steve Abe, his family and our family have been friends for 4 generations. He lent me some really great books. This one is called Odyssey, and I'm not even sure if one could even get this book anymore. It was written a long time ago, and what I found fascinating about this book as I was looking through it, and it actually talks about, there's a little section on my grandfather, but I'd seen these drawings of Tacoma's downtown, and I didn't realize it's from this book. So this one, someone drew out all of the different businesses in the downtown core that were owned by Japanese. There's some fun things like, tofu shops and, laundry shops and such. And then there's other cities as well. Like this one is on the right is Seattle. And then I think they have in here is Portland. So you can see on the West Coast, there were especially in the Northwest, there were quite a few Japanese towns. So this is very valuable resource. He also lent me this one. It's called Nisei, and I find the title very interesting because it's called The Quiet Americans. And then the history of Japanese in Tacoma. So these are fantastic. Then the other Tacoma resource was recently written. This is Lisa Hoffman and Mary Hanneman wrote Becoming Nisei, and they interviewed my mom and her sisters and family friends to create this book. Some of the more disturbing things that I have discovered is, and I feel it so much more deeply now. It's always been a very troubling story, but when the Japanese Americans were in the camps, in the beginning, the Nisei boys, the second generation boys, who were mostly around college age, I would say, I think, wanted to go serve in the war. And I should say they wanted to serve in the war before they were put into camps. Then they were put into the camps, and then the government decided, let's try to recruit them. And so to prove their loyalty on behalf of the whole community, a lot of them went to go serve. And they were called the 442, the regimental combat team. And so they were taken to some of the worst battles in Europe. And those stories always just made me feel so sad. But now that I know more of the history, it's more disturbing. Grit City magazine. I worked very closely with Sierra, one of the editors, and he did this amazing job of finding this photo of my mother's former home. So growing up, after Temple, we would always go across the street to this house on Fawcett, and it was my mother's home, and now her sister was raising her family there. And I never really thought about it. I never really thought about, well, why is it that we have a home, our family has a home, and nobody else does? And so I think it was about when I was in college or high school, I heard the story about how my grandfather had a great relationship with an attorney. And in my imagination, my grandfather gave the attorney the money for the house. And then I know the attorney bought the house on behalf of my grandfather. And it was torn down or burned down. In the story of Grit City magazine, I started off where my children and I are watching the house burn. And it's on the footprint of University of Washington, Tacoma, and they had torn down all of the homes on Fawcett, pretty much all of them except for this house that my mom grew up in. And then he took this photo, which I think is interesting because he stood in the exact same place where this photo was. So he tried to line up the two photos to show the before and after. So my children and I are watching this house burn, and it's burning because it is a training exercise for the fire department. And they're chatting, and the guys are, doing the hose and all of that. And I'm thinking in my mind, like, wow, these guys, they're doing their job, what they're supposed to be doing, but they could know the history of the house.
Out of the darkness, out of the past, come words that have now become our task. Unintelligible, nondescript, bubbling up. Unspoken whispers from unknown lips. An ill-gotten language never fully heard yet felt. Most every day. Ancestral words float to the surface, long lost on some cold, lonely iceberg, left floating in a murky sea of nothingness. Mountains of stories left behind, left hanging deeply below, misunderstood.
The time period is 1969. It's 2 years after the Summer of Love. And Michiko left camp, and she went. So at some point she comes back, she lives in Chicago with her husband and 3 children.
So we're about to drive home. So what did you get out of that? You got some criticism or some comments? What did they have to say?
I have to say, when I was reading, I felt a little out of breath. And my heart was racing, but it's always good to do it. In fact, just a few months ago, she heard Mrs. Johansson. When I first would go, I wrote some things about my experiences that my mom had went through, even though the book is not about my mom. And I would cry and cry during my readings. I must have cried at least 5 times. Mrs. Johansson's family sitting on wicker furniture that now sat tattered on the front porch. At night, when the lights glowed from inside, a library was visible from the street. Michiko had also heard a young family from San Francisco purchased the Johansson home. Michiko wanted to do the right thing, to be welcoming. So with a plate of snickerdoodles, everyone's so generous and nice, and I don't feel judged, so it's a really great group. And a boy of about 4 opened a wooden screen door. His shorts were faded, and his long wavy brown hair touched the shoulders of his shirtless body. Today we celebrated the 30th anniversary of Amoy Day, and it's amazing because the leader has kept it going. Her first members have passed on, her second group has passed on, and so it must be kind of hard for her, but she keeps going. In terms of the way my mom raised me, I won't even include my siblings, and the way that I'm raising my children, I think, again, for her to have this goal. I have the goal of trying to create a peaceful home. I think my mom had the same goal, but she approached it differently. Peaceful home meant maybe protecting us from certain, information about how the government what the government did to our community. Whereas, so for me, I think I want to also create peace in the home, but I do that through sharing with my kids what I'm processing. And, one could say, talk about what happened to the Japanese and what the government did to them, and leave it at that, and just leave it with, okay, let's all be just angry at the government. But I think it's our responsibility to talk about, well, so how did the Japanese persevere after? How did the government, through the redress movement, say, we made a big mistake? There was a lack of leadership.
This action was taken without trial, without jury. It was based solely on race, for these 120,000 were Americans of Japanese descent. Yes, the nation was then at war, struggling for its survival, and it's not for us today to pass judgment upon those who may have made mistakes while engaged in that great struggle. Yet we must recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake.